Voilà, bonjour à tout le monde. Bonjour.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to our two writers, Claire Touzard and Olivier Vonlanthen. We're on the second day of the Bibliotopia Festival, and the title of this session is Turmoil, Distress, and the Reaction Against Madness of the World. Maybe just a brief introduction of both of you. Claire Touzard, you've worked in the media for several years as a journalist, editor, and producer. You're also an author. And your second novel, Féminin, was published in 2022 and delves into the seedy underbelly of the media industry. Before that, you published a more personal text, Sans alcool, in 2021, which chronicles the diary of your sobriety and lays the groundwork for a line that runs through all your texts, or most of your texts, the tension between normative and transgressive, between illness and capitalism, much like your third book, which is the one we'll be discussing today, Folie et résistance, which was published in 2025 by Divergences. Just a few words about the text for those of you who may not have yet read it. The story is your story. It starts with your diagnosis in 2023 of bipolar disorder. Starting there, you dissect the medical, social, historical, cultural, and political systems. Yesterday, we heard an excerpt of your work. Your diagnosis coincided with your activism for Gaza. And yet you offer an alternative interpretation, shifting the perspective of this thesis. Madness is not where we expect it. How can one not be mad in a sick system? So you construct a narrative that takes your personal history at its starting point, but whose vanishing point extends outward as your essay lays bare a deeply corrupt society. Olivier Vonlanthen, you're a French teacher, poet, and novelist. We first came to know you through your poetry collection, Ossuaire. And here with Notre-Dame des Démolis, you present your first novel, published by La Veilleuse in 2025 in the Nuit Noire collection. It's a debut novel that takes us through the journey of Marthe, a shattered life. So, a spoiler for those of you who haven't read it, but we need to set the stage for the discussion. The novel opens with a murder in Montpellier in 1968. It's the murder of a wealthy woman by her companion Marthe. The police investigation comes to a rather abrupt halt with Marthe's institutionalization and her being pilloried with a label of insanity that stigmatizes her. The social inquiry, on the other hand, unravels the story, since it's less the crime that will be dissected than the life journey of Marthe that led her here in the first place. This journey is composed of different fragments going in reverse order from 1968 to 1949, from France to Switzerland via Morocco. And herein you describe the class-based violence and humiliations Marthe endures, as well as the harsh acts that mark her daily life as a maid. And in fact, the very dark reality of her story, where everything, or almost everything, becomes a trace or an indication of a necrotic system. So we have two very different texts here in an essay and a novel, but both of these are very personal texts, and both have political overtones because you're less interested in symptoms than the expression of madness. Thank you for being with us today. Let me begin with our first question, which is very closely tied to the theme of this edition of Bibliotopia, and that is, how did you approach the question of madness? Claire Touzard, you note at the beginning of your book that the term madness has been banished from medical and psychoanalytic jargon for some time, but you propose to use it as a lens, a key, or an entry pass. In other words, you decide to embrace this term, and you say, and I quote, "I will therefore be mad." Is this a form of rehabilitation, or rather a different way of approaching the topic through what you would call a decryption key, which would go beyond the label madness that often serves as a sort of response to any effort to understand? What I understood what I like about the term madness is that in today's neoliberal systems, the word has disappeared. When you get a diagnosis, as I do, of bipolar disorder, you can't dissociate this from the term madness. Why not? Because people who have been diagnosed before that using DSM, which is a psychiatrist's Bible, are people who have been locked up, called hysterical, crazy. Homosexuals were diagnosed using the DSM at one point. So the term madness is tied to these diagnoses, even though we trying to do away with it. Even before I was diagnosed, I was called crazy for many reasons, because I was a woman reporter, because I was a feminist, and the word stuck to me. Even though the psychiatrists tried to use kinder, more compassionate terms that are coercive, but they tend to try to make you feel that you're not crazy. So I decided to look more closely at madness and what it means today. As Michel Foucault said, madness is a social construct at a given time. Every epoch has its own definition of madness. So who are the crazy people today? And without confusing things, I mean, just because you have a mental disorder doesn't mean that you're crazy. But I wanted to retake ownership of this term, look at who's crazy today, who are the crazy people, and perhaps using a human rights approach. My work in favor of Gaza is considered crazy because it causes me to take a lot of risks, because it's in the media. So you can see how today's standards are colored by capitalism, patriarchal society, etc. So I question this term without confusing it with psychiatric terms, because there are other terms concerned with diagnosis that are more specific. So madness becomes a kind of lucidity. You can take back your madness, and in doing so, take back some of your own power. Well, in the same way that the queer community has taken back this term that used to be used to stigmatize them, I think it's important to take back the term crazy or mad. There are mad pride parades that are organized nowadays because everybody's questioning the standards. Who is entitled to decide who's crazy in our society? The standards that are imposed on us, the type of rationality that's imposed on us. It's a form of social control. By diagnosing people, there's a claim that you're helping them, but sometimes it's the opposite. I think it's important to know that in our society, these norms are often very violent. I think we should be able to question these diagnoses and what they depict. I don't know if madness is a form of lucidity. That's maybe a romantic notion, but it's a way of discrediting people. Today, crazy people are the militants, because this is also a way of discrediting their political leanings and show that they're irrational because their choice isn't the right one. in the same way that women, feminists, have been called hysterical. And a lot of black activists were considered to be schizophrenic. So madness is a way of calling people irrational when in fact there are social or political constructs at stake. These are people who are denouncing bad standards and norms. We'll be talking about this tomorrow when we talk about outsider art and militantism. Olivier Vonlanthen, you have a different approach. In your novel, madness is initially unnamed and kept at a distance, perhaps precisely because the definition is elusive. You use the term that. And let me just quote the text at the beginning of the chapter entitled Arrest, just after the murder, where you write, if it were just that, yet that very thing comes to blur everything, the real and otherwise sound mind of the mustachioed sergeant from Montpellier. And at that point, a breach opens. As soon as the word insanity is written, 7 letters to materialize the thing, while rendering invisible what lies behind it. And then the term of severe paranoid schizophrenia, which ranges through psychosis to madness. What conclusions, and you must draw conclusions from this plurality of terms. How did you approach it, including through language? Maybe the political dimension enters into it too. Well, first of all, insanity is the first word that is used to judge Marthe, who's just killed someone. What struck me immediately in this term was that this immediately deprives someone of their mind. It means that her mind has left her. She is out of her mind. It's a sanctioning word which doesn't take into account the person's psychological suffering. It's a way to put the person at a distance and refuse to see them as an individual. However, in her character, there's something that resists, that's difficult to approach, the that of the sergeant. He doesn't know how to talk about this. He knows that words are insufficient to describe it and will probably never be sufficient. For me, this was a way to compensate for the impossibility of describing something aptly, including a justice system. A system which doesn't seem to be able to describe something in all its dimensions. So I don't want to minimize the seriousness of her act, but I wanted to give her the possibility to exist as an individual. And that's why I used this reverse chronology. It's not really the murder mystery, it's more of a social investigation. Well, that's interesting because this plurality of terms helps us to shift our gaze. There's a scene where Marthe is looking out the window, standing looking out the window, and you say that she's looking at a point outside the frame. So maybe this is a way of saying she's leaving the frame, the norm in which she's been imprisoned. So the issue of the investigation, these two genres are very different, a novel and an essay, but they do have a common driving force, which is an investigation. How was the investigation conducted? A police investigation and a social investigation in your case. How was it conducted? What material was prioritized? What obstacles did you encounter or were encountered? And quite simply, what motivated the investigation? Coming back to you, the psychosocial dimension, because obviously there's a criminal investigation and a psychosocial investigation. So what kind of documents did you have access to? Archives or other documents? And how did your investigation unfold? There's a press cutting with just 2 sentences, and so literature had to step in and fill in the gaps. Is that what fiction does? Does it fill in gaps or reveal another side of the story, or both?
Alors peut-être pour répondre en 2 temps à la question.
Perhaps I could answer this in 2 parts, give a 2-part answer. My first answer is this story is based on a news item, a small news item. This, but it's connected to my family. So it was a way to approach this in a different way. You know that Roland Barthes said that these small news items are self-contained. But I didn't like that definition, so this is why I decided to delve into this story. And to answer your question about the investigation, it started with an actual document, one of the few documents I actually got, which is the indictment sheet or arraignment sheet. It was terrifying. It took me a long time to be able to figure it out, read it. There were things like training, L and E. There are categories that were just filled in. That's one of the only documents I got. I had press cuttings. We got press cuttings because I worked with my father on this. He helped me with the research. And since he's the closest person in the family to the person who I based the character on, he tried to find information in the archives in Montpellier, but very quickly we hit a wall in a way that was fortuitous. And to answer the second part of your question, yes, literature, in my case, in any case, is a way to fill in the lack of documentation and administrative documents, and I tried to do that by using the chronology and building around those by writing what I thought must have happened. Claire, you talk about madness and resistance. Talk about the resistance part, if you will. I had written a first account of my withdrawal from alcoholism. It was a very personal account, and I wanted to use a different literary form. I didn't necessarily want to write about my daily life as a bipolar person. Since I'd been assigned this term, I decided to find out what it means. Does it really exist? Where does this label come from? And it was important for me. I was always wary of care as it's offered. So my background is somebody who hasn't had a lot of care. A lot of people talk about their 15 years of psychiatric support. I've always rebelled against those. There's a feminist aspect to this. I refused the domination of the medical corps because of bad experiences, violence from a doctor when I was young. And I decided to investigate in a different way by reading, talking to militants, bell hooks, was one of them, and many other women who I've read throughout my life and who helped me understand the political dimension of what I was going through. So often the diagnosis erases women's backgrounds and histories. When you have a psychosis, a psychotic crisis because of violence that you've undergone, the anti-psychiatric militants, Kate Millett and others, who were committed because they were lesbians, because they stood up against their husbands, and their emancipation was to go out and hit the road and refuse to take their medication. Ellie Miles and others, she talks about how being LGBT was considered to be a pathology at a certain time. And I realized that that research was healing for me. It replaced the care that I never got. And that's what I'm trying to do with my book, to pass on. It's not a self-help book. It's text that and information that I got together for me and others who are in the same situation.
This explains the structure of the essay, layer by layer. It's polyphonic. You mentioned lots of cases, many major figures. You quote your voice, enters in resonance with others, Michel Foucault, Audre Lorde, amongst others. It's part of your investigation, and it's a way to come back to the cultural understanding of madness, the fact that it's understood differently in different places, but it's also cross-cutting. The issue of madness is cross-cutting. Everybody who fought against the system, who were considered abnormal at one point, be they queer, be they racialized, or whatever, were considered crazy. So madness covers all of it, and it continues to pathologize people, imposed norms and rationality. So obviously there's an intersection. But the issue of madness also raised the value of lives. People who are diagnosed, who suffer, who can't work, who are disabled, in a sense, people who are very much affected by the suffering, which is inflicted by the system. We try to depoliticize this by individualizing their suffering, whereas they suffer because of the system. These are people who don't have an economic value that is assigned to them. They have no value for capitalistic society, and therefore have been marginalized by it. It raised the issue of value assigned to lives. Judith Butler talks about this. People who are dominated, who can be locked in, children, seniors, people who are sick, who don't have any economic value. And this is also in my book. It's also a way of showing the different dimensions of madness. You show the number of paradoxes, depending on who is said to be mad. You talk about figures, political figures from the left and the right, Elon Musk, Greta Thunberg. It's seen as a disadvantage to the left, as an advantage to the right, capitalistic discourse. Well, first of all, people who impose these norms are obviously dominant. They decide who's mad, and they don't consider themselves as mad. Whereas if you look at the system as it currently is and its leaders, obviously everything's wrong. But they impose it on everybody else. They impose norms that are absolutely incredible. And there are many things in relation to this. First of all, we've got to be careful when we pathologize things, people. Saying that Donald Trump is crazy disregards the violence his system imposes. It's very well structured, very rational, supremacist. And saying that he's crazy denies all of this. And on the contrary, for activists to the left, saying they're crazy depoliticizes their struggle. So we've got to be careful in using these terms to describe the political sphere. It's also reminiscent of eugenism. It would be like saying that there are brains that are sick and brains that are sane, which is not the case. So we've got to be really careful when we wield these words. Elon Musk, and there's something that's interesting. People who hold power use their disorders and highlight them. Elon Musk is part of a group of people who are on the autistic spectrum, and they use this as a sign of their superiority. It can come and fuel fascist discourse, so we've got to be careful in the way we pathologize things. Just coming back to the starting point of the readings that you reference in your book. There are also some, Olivier, in your novel, Notre-Dame des Démolis. There are a certain number of epigraphs and quotes that can be found at the beginning of the chapters. Goes from Johnny Cash to Maupassant, so the whole gamut. And you end with a family picture, a family scene, which highlights the link between you, the author, and the character of Marthe. From a general point of view, what's your take on this cultural heritage, these quotes, and then the family heritage with the picture that closes your account? What's your take on it? For the quotes, what I wanted to do is quote authors. And some of these quotes are quotes from authors who were accused of being crazy, who were considered crazy. Amongst them, there are two more specifically whom I particularly like. They move me a lot. Antonin Artaud. He establishes a long list, starting with anxiety, and the anxiety that your physician doesn't understand, or something to that effect. And for me, someone like Antonin Artaud, who is someone who tried to describe madness, he's someone that moves me very much. And also Guy de Maupassant, who's someone that moved me even more than his texts, because he thinks about the issue of madness, who affected him, who affected his brother, who was committed to a psychiatric ward. That's for the first part. And then Johnny Cash, for instance, since you gave the example, he's a singer whom I adore. I appreciate his activism, his political activism, which is the reason why I wanted to quote him. He gave concerts in different prisons. And then the last photograph, the last snapshot, it's both a conclusion and a starting point. I might be spoiling the novel, but I am on that picture. I'm the baby in the picture. I'm there together with my parents. And then there's the real Marthe. It was impossible for me to imagine her life with this, to reconcile her life and this picture, which is very gentle, it's very nice, but it was a way to loop the loop, to close the circle, to come full circle. Is it a picture that you came upon very early during your investigation or at a later stage? I discovered it at a fairly late stage, and this is what actually led me to write the novel. All of a sudden, I had the conclusion to my novel. Claire, you referred previously to reparation. This is something that you mention on the last page of your novel. You talk about texts that save. It appeared in the quote, in the excerpt that was read out yesterday evening. You talk about it in the foreword and clear at the end. And I think in both your texts, there's restitution, those who have been made invisible. What's your approach to the notion of reparation? Is there reparation? What is there to repair? Well, first of all, I use the word reparation because I don't want to use the word healing, because I don't think you can heal from suffering. You just learn to live with it. There are things that can save you, things that can help, things that can become an objective in your life. I know that life is violent. I take full advantage of moments in life when I'm happy. I live through chaos. I take power over labels that have been assigned to me. We've placed in the state's hands the power to name our suffering, and literature and other types of art help us take control back over these words. They help us choose other words to describe our journey. What you find in my text, since you're talking about reparation, is care. It's a philosophical issue which is absolutely critical given the genocide in Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon. The year of mental health in France coincided with this genocide, and to me it was very upsetting. We were talking about health and mental health at a point in time when our country was contributing to bombing children, traumatizing children in a way they'll never be able to recover from. They're experiencing continuous violence. The trauma is of such a magnitude that it's hard to fathom. And the capitalistic system, the way it exists, rejects care. It considers care in a sense where it's only control over bodies and minds. And even the people who are doing their best within the system, physicians and other healthcare workers, they're working in a neoliberal capitalistic system that they have to call out the violence of their own system. The issue of care is critical. If care is control, it inevitably leads to fascism. We have to question this beyond care as diagnosis, as isolation. We have to wonder about what we want. We have to try and leave our isolation, connect with others. To me, reparation is all of this. It's not just reading mantras, practicing yoga, and retiring in nature. Inviting people to withdraw from the world, this goes against social cohesion. We need the exact opposite. It's the issue of care is a philosophical issue. It helps me be active in this direction. It helped me repair myself. Yes, and at one point you asked whether those who are crazy need to be put under medication, or whether it's the system, the capitalistic system, that needs to be put under medication. This question also lies implicitly in Notre-Dame des Démolis. It ends with an episode that takes place in a cave that's been carved out and as a tribute to Our Lady of Lourdes to repair a plague afflicting livestock, hence the issue of reparation. It's a cave into which Marthe takes refuge, where she no longer feels her body, but instead senses a type of caress. This cave, which will be called Notre-Dame des Démolis, their reparation in the demolition. Is the cave more like a tomb? How do you consider it? Well, to answer your question, I look at things from a different perspective by presenting Marthe as a very religious character. She's a firm believer. There's the worship to Mary. She's got deep-seated faith. To me, this scene is a scene of mystical, it's a mystical epiphany for the character. It's an assumption. Notre-Dame des Démolis is a place, but it's also a character, a holy character, a saint. A saint who's been abused, brutalized. In this cave, she's still rather young, and she has this revelation. And to answer the issue, to your question about reparation, I find that term very interesting because to me, faith is something that you can hold on to. I'm not a staunch believer, but seeing this from outside, I can respect her faith. It saves her from the silence of the system that participates in the destruction of individuals such as she is. What Claire said a while ago, I can relate to. Very often, the people who are said to be crazy have simply been destroyed by the system. And so my account of this is there to say, well, there's the system all around. There's the endpoint, the murder. Is there a causality relationship? I can't answer, but there's the entire system all around. A few days ago, I heard Geoffroy de la Gannerie, the sociologist and philosopher, who spoke about abolitionism. I'm very interested in these questions. He said one of the problems of the judiciary is that it judges individuals and not situations. And what he suggests is to judge situations instead of judging individuals. And this is exactly what I tried to do. Maybe that's a form of repair, or reparation. The deconstruction and reconstruction, in a sense. It's mentioned in the novel. This space was there, it was destroyed, and then rebuilt with this cave. It's a place that does actually exist now. We said so a while ago, but your texts also convey something political, a political gesture. There's the restoration of a voice and a place, but there's also the restoration of actions, far more so than words. It's interesting to think about language, condition, order, domination, and a form of resistance to language, a disruption of reason, as you say in your book, Claire. Marthe's resistance is expressed through numbers rather than letters. 9 knife stabs in her employer's body, 7 letters to the word dementia. Silence also permeates the text. Marthe speaks relatively rarely, but we are made to hear her story, and there's a strong link between madness and resistance, the body. And this is what the novel opens with. When Marthe pulls the medal out of her employer's body after the first stab, she says it's still resisting. And then the theme of the body, this time Marthe's body, runs throughout the narrative, ranging from the absent body seen without a head, arms, legs during prayer, to the massive body of a peasant woman who crushes the children in her care in Morocco. It's also a body that is inhabited. She knows her surroundings in her muscles. It's a body that works, but it's also a disembodied body, fractured by physical labor and sexual violence. You dissociate Marthe and her body at one point. They're 2 distinct entities, so what's the relationship between the body and madness? Well, to come back to the beginning of your question, it still resists, a body still resists. I felt the need to imagine as much as possible what it meant to stab a body 9 times with a knife, outside of any moral consideration. The will that such a gesture requires. And my starting idea was that to understand this violence, I had to describe these 9 knife stabs longer than they would have lasted. It was important to me to be able to count them, to be able to say 1, 2, 3, and count up to 9, pausing between each. It gives more weight to this act. It's something that doesn't come easy. Secondly, what I wanted to show is that Marthe's body is a body that can be subsumed to her physical work, including, and when it comes to murder her employer, she does it just as well as she sweeps or washes the floor. She's a professional in her submission. That's what I wanted to show. And then, in terms of her silence, I wanted to show that she had been silenced because people thought she was dumb, maybe. She wasn't adapted, and she decided not to speak up. She might have a fragile ego. I mean, there may be a lot of hypotheses, but the suffering is there.
Yes, very early on, and perhaps I'll just quote a short passage from your text. In the inside cover, in the chapter called The Disaster, perhaps this is the moment where everything is decided and everything is imprinted on the heart and the body of Marthe. a moment of silence before the terminal disaster, the accomplishment of the act. I was
Ça m'a fait penser à la colonie pénitentiaire de Kafka.
I was wondering about your imagery. You used the word. You use a term that a harrow. So, Claire Touzard, the relationship to the body is very much present in the USA as well, from the medical body to the sick body, the battered body, battered by pregnancy, work, physical and sexual violence, somatization. It's a stigma, it's a symptom of a sick society, but it's also a tool of resistance. You say, I was becoming a phantom body. I no longer wanted to work inside such a system. My very flesh was rebelling and refusing to comply. So, is the corps then both a medium and a driving force of madness? Well, I think that suffering writes itself on the body. And in today's society, some minorities are physically threatened. Bellux says this. She says, since I was a child, I should say that she's a Black American essayist. Since she's a child, she's been told, don't act crazy because they'll lock you up. And then there's police violence on racialized people. All of this maintains a sort of reign of terror. And the question is, what bodies are allowed to live in our society? What bodies are not threatened on a daily basis? Which bodies are considered normal enough to be safe? Whether we're talking about women on the street, whose bodies are threatened every day. Yes, the body is part of the reflection, because if you've undergone suffering, financial suffering, or like Marthe, class suffering, the body is harmed, it's damaged. And look at the result in our systems. People are told, well, it's your fault, get some help, get care, to try to integrate into the system that's treating you badly. But I think the body speaks when people can no longer manage. They can't go to work. They can't. You can force yourself up to a certain point, but psychological suffering is going to make your body cave in sooner or later. If you talk to people who've been exiled, they've been the victims of violence, and fascism is also a way of controlling bodies. My book is called Madness and Resistance because for some people, existing is resisting with everything that the system has put them through. Audre Lorde, when I talk about resistance, I'm not talking about political activism. I'm not telling people to go out and demonstrate. I'm talking about existing for some people who are going through extreme psychological or physical suffering, because the system is manhandling them daily, and they're extremely vulnerable. So that's what resistance is for me. It's putting all these mistreated bodies back in the spotlight so people can be seen, so they can be recognized, so it can be said, this is what the system did to their bodies. And so we can rebuild our society accordingly. Yes, how can you be happy and how can you not be mad in a sick system? You mentioned the case of Luigi Mangione, who killed the CEO of a big insurance company in the US, Brian Thompson, who, like Marthe, only became dangerous when he reproduced the violence of the system that he was living in. Well, capitalism has accustomed us to the slow destruction of our bodies, especially if you're poor, and a slow, silent death. Rob Nixon is a thinker who has coined the term slow violence. This is the violence of capitalism, people who are exploited, who are poor, and who die in their hundreds of thousands. And this is particularly pronounced in the U.S. I don't know if you have heard about Luigi Mangione, a young man from a good family in the U.S. who one day went out and killed Brian Thompson, who's the president of a big insurance company that refuses to refund care for poor people. And the question this poses is, are we allowed to kill people who are killing people? It's a way of throwing the violence back in the bourgeoisie's face. The violence of the bourgeoisie, as Nicolas Framont says, is always euphemized. They are the ones who hold the official discourse. And Luigi Mangione's act turns that on its head. I'm not saying that he was right to do this or that we should support this kind of violence, but there is a slow violence against people in society. People are committing suicide because of burnout, people who are doing dangerous jobs. All of these deaths due to the system, and I think it's important to bring these back to the forefront and find a more compassionate language for them. Capitalism has tried to convince us that it's there for us, but it's all about coercion, violence, and death on a daily basis. So it's important to understand that, and understand that the more authoritarian regimes are, the more people are going to be affected in this way. It's a way of showing another side of the story. This is what happens in your novel. There's a certain form of paradox or dissonance between the character of Marthe, who's very pious, very quiet, very self-effacing, compared to the brutality of her act, 9 knife stabs. And then there's a more historical dissonance, because as we heard earlier, the events take place in 1968, period of liberation. Perhaps what you're saying is that liberation wasn't for everyone. Could you tell us a bit more about this? This apparent paradox, the way of, is it a way of showing us another facet of Marthe's story? The almanac of the Midi Libre that I put in the text gives the main events taking place in May 68 in Montpellier and elsewhere. A new brand of dog food was invented. The almanac also talks about Tommy Smith's.
Et puis, il y a évidemment mai 68 en écho de tout ça. Et effectivement,
action.
J'ai perçu la situation de Marthe comme une espèce
I see Marthe's situation as somebody whose trajectory has been forgotten. May 1968 did take place with all the social upheaval in a certain framework, and liberation that was in fact not for everyone. It wasn't for the poor and it wasn't for women. So I wanted to show a very modern trajectory. It's not that long ago. I mean, I met this woman, so it wasn't that long ago. And at the same time, it's the opposite of what a man would have been experiencing at the same time, a man of the same social milieu who might have been able to avoid the suffering, and she wasn't able to. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, both of you, for your texts, which show up a phenomenon that seems so obvious that it's been invisibilized and comes out very clearly and strongly in your text. Thank you very much. I'd like to open this out to the audience now. Do you have any... how are we supposed to see you? There's a glare. Someone will bring you a microphone.
Bonjour. C'est une question.
Hello. I have a question for Claire.
Avant tout, merci pour votre colère. Ça fait vraiment.
Thank you for your anger. It's very appealing. And for your podcasts on propaganda, I'm giving you a plug for your podcast. I hope the whole audience will listen to it. I wanted to ask you if you were able to say something to Claire Touzard as a very young woman, what would you tell her to help her get through what she's about to go through? The problem is that she might not go through what I went through. But anyway, I would tell her it's not her fault. For a long time, I thought all of this was my fault. I was born in the 1980s. When we were young, we didn't have the echoes of feminism. I learned about it through my mother, but it wasn't that common. So I was afraid that my suffering was because I'd done something wrong. If somebody mistreated me, it was my fault. If I was discriminated against, it was my fault. So this more lucid perspective on the system came much later. So throwing off the guilt is important, and understanding that it's a systemic problem. But that came much later. I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you very much.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre?
Any other questions?
Salut. Est-ce qu'on peut dire la même chose aux jeunes hommes, aux hommes en général?
Could we say the same thing to the young men or to young men in general? Well, that depends on the topic. About abuse, mistreatment. I think it's interesting today to interrogate certain forms of masculinity that are experiencing violence. We're starting to talk about this now from the perspective of racism. Racialized men are victims of police violence, colonial violence. These are interesting questions. So, yes, my book is an attempt to say that when suffering is individualized, and you're made to think that it's your fault, that it's a family problem, and they just that won't work, rather than what Olivier is saying, and a social perspective on violence and suffering. I think it's important today to do this and to take the responsibility off our shoulders. I'm not saying that nobody should bear responsibility for their actions. I'm just saying that we need to see that the system has to bear a large part of the responsibility. That's important. Well, thank you very much. If you have not read these books, go and buy them as quickly as possible.